Well, welcome back to Face the Nation. Time now for the fun part. For this year's book panel, we thought we'd try something a little different, a summer reading show, looking at some of this year's hottest thrillers with some of the country's best-known mystery writers. Sandra Brown has written over 70 novels. 63 of them have made the New York Times bestseller list. Her latest is Mean Streak. It will be out next month. Lee Child and Jeffery Deaver have written 51 novels between them. They contributed to Face Off, and they both have new books out. Lee Child's 19th Jack Reacher novel is called Personal. It will be out later this summer. Jeffery Deaver's main character is Lincoln Rhymes. His new one is The Skin Collector. We'd also like to welcome Karin Slaughter, who's written 14 thrillers. Her new one is Coptown. And our last panelist, someone familiar to Face the Nation viewers, in addition to his day job as a columnist for the Washington Post, David Ignatius writes thrillers too. His latest is The Director. So welcome to you guys. I must say, is it safe to be here? Because there are people who truly think evil thoughts. You sit around thinking about how to kill people. And I just, as we get on with this, I want to ask you about, the inspiration you have, does it come from personal experience? Does it come from the newspapers? Where does it come from? But first, Lee and Jeffery, I want to ask you about this new book that you are both a part of. This is a book called Face Off, and it is about what? How many writers here?
There's 22 writers that paired up to write 11 stories, and
tell us what this is about.
Well, it's about readers. I mean, we're readers fundamentally, and all readers have one or two or three or four favorite characters, and they start daydreaming, what happened if this guy and this guy were in the same story? So that's what we did. We have, for instance, Dennis Lehane and Michael Connelly bringing together their characters in the same story. And 11 pairs of people did that. And it was a lot of fun.
Now, Lee is the head of an organization called International Thriller Writers. And he can speak about it probably better than I can, but I've been a member for some time now. And this is a group that nurtures young beginning writers and is also part of the established mystery writer organizations. Been around for about 10 years now, right?
Yeah, 10 years.
And I guess that we should point out, this is a Simon & Schuster book. Simon & Schuster is owned by CBS. But you take the proceeds from this, and it supports your Thriller Writer Association.
Yes, and the ITW is a membership fee free. People can join for free if they like to. And this is one of the projects that Lee and a number of other people have put together to fund that.
Well, I tell you, it's just fabulous. I've read about 4 of these stories in here, and they're really fun because you can. It's a great book to read before you go to bed. You read just
bite-sized,
and then you can turn in and read another one.
And what's fun too is that writers tend not to play well with others, and this was sort of a forced opportunity to put us together with some other folks and see what came out.
Well, that's great. You know, one of the things is as a writer of nonfiction books, I know how to do that. I would not know where to start in writing a book of fiction. And David, you've done both. I mean, you know, you're a columnist for the Washington Post, and your new book, The Director, is about the CIA, and it's post-Snowden. It was almost like, did you start this book before Snowden?
Yes, I started it a year before we'd ever heard of Snowden, but that's a good example. You come up with a plot that embodies things you know are going on in the world, this collision between the world of hacking and the world of espionage. And then along comes real life, and real life is different than, in some ways more interesting than what you had imagined, so you rework. And I think it's that process of taking real things and then reworking them in our imagination that make them feel more real for the readers. I mean, you know, you could write a 100,000-word newspaper story, but that wouldn't be very interesting to read. A novel's 100,000 words that's different and powerful.
Sandra Brown, you know, one of the things I discovered, as I say, I write nonfiction things when I write books, but I did kind of branch out into songwriting, which is, there's a certain fiction in there. And what I've discovered as a songwriter, you better have an excuse that you can explain to your wife why you wrote this particular song. You know, and so when I read your books, and I must say, another full disclosure, Sandra and I go way back. She's an old TCU gal. Like we both went to TCU. She worked as an intern at the Star-Telegram.
That's right. That's when I first met Bob Schieffer.
But let me ask you this. You have a lot of steamy sex scenes in some of your books. And is that a problem for you? Because I know you're happily married.
Well, it's not a problem for me, and I think my readers love it. But I think you're referring to one time Michael was reading, my husband was reading a passage, and he was, you know, this is really good. But we never did this. It keeps him on his toes. But I always say, well, I write about murder, but I've never killed anybody either. You know, so it is fiction, still fiction.
Yeah, Karin, tell us about your new book, because this is a standalone. This is not a character that you've dealt with before, right?
It is. It's two new characters, actually, two women who are police officers, and it's set in Atlanta in the 1970s, which is just a fascinating time for me because I was a kid, so I wasn't paying a lot of attention. But for women during that time period, there were so few legal protections for them. So if a woman wanted to get a car loan or buy a house or rent an apartment or even get a credit card, she had to have a man co-sign with her. And that was just shocking for me to learn that. And then, you know, fast forward into the 1970s, you had a lot of new laws to protect them. I write about Atlanta, so the laws didn't quite reach there for a while. But even something like birth control, you know, in 1972, a case came up before the Supreme Court, and prior to that, a woman was not allowed to legally have contraception unless she was married. So in effect, she had to have a man's permission. And it's really funny because you fast forward 40 years and now we have to have permission from 5 Supreme Court justices to get birth control. But just writing about that, I think probably everyone here agrees with me. The point of writing a thriller is to sort of hold a mirror up to society and show people what's going on. And if you write about it in the 1970s, you can complain a lot more than if you write about it now.
Jeffrey and Lee, you both write character books. One of you writes the Jack Reacher books. The other writes the Lincoln Rhymes book. I would like to ask you, how did you dream up these characters? Because they are really one-of-a-kind guys. And I guess that's what you're trying to do.
Sure. This was about 15 years ago, and I was looking for a new book idea to write. And I always listen to what readers expect. And I write a very fast-paced, kind of cinematic novel. That's the formula for a Deaver novel, and I'll always do that. But I always want a different hook, something that's going to make readers perk up their ears a bit. And I decided to do a new version of Sherlock Holmes. It had nothing to do with the original Conan Doyle story, but what I wanted was a character who had to outthink the villain. I didn't want the bad guy and the good guy to be in that climactic scene at the end where suddenly the hero has a flashback to his youth and he says, oh, my dad taught me to karate kick this certain way or kickbox when I was a young boy and now I remember it, then he beats up the bad guy. That's kind of a cliche. So Lincoln Rhyme, being a quadriplegic, paralyzed from the neck down, has to outthink the villain. I created The Bone Collector, the first in the series. Never thought it would be popular. I was proud of the book. It seemed to do well, and then it took off around the world. You know, millions and millions of copies.
Your characters are much different.
Yeah, and that is pure wish fulfillment. I just thought, what would I do if I could get away with it? And Jack Reacher was the answer to that. I mean, he lives in a way that I think a lot of us would like to live, always moving on, owns nothing, lives nowhere, no job, no home, just free. And the freedom of Reacher is what a lot of people respond to.
He is what we would do if we could really do what we really wanted to do.
Exactly, yeah. And I used to think, originally I thought that was a man's thing. I thought men would understand that fantasy, but over the years I've learned it's actually a women's fantasy too, that they could just walk away from it all, be somewhere else tomorrow, that they don't know, they've never been before. And so that's what, there's disadvantages to it because there's no support system around him. There's no soap opera. You know, he doesn't have a job, he doesn't have a boss, he doesn't have friends or neighbors. It's just him. So each book is relatively difficult to do because it's just him. And how do you get him involved? You know, he's not a cop, so he shouldn't be involved. So every chapter 1 is about how do we get him into this story. But once he's in, then it's great because he can be anywhere, do anything. As you said, 19 books. And I thought I would be getting sort of bored of it by 19 books, but because every story can be completely different. I mean, this new one, Personal, part of it is set in Paris, part of it's set in London. It's extremely glamorous for a Reacher book. You know, normally Reacher is hanging out in some $20 motel in the West somewhere, but no, he's in Paris this time.
I just was thinking about this as we put this panel together. I didn't mean it to be this way, but 4 out of 5 of you used to be journalists in one way or another. David still is, and I guess
I can't escape it. But in my fiction, I do get to imagine what if the things that I'm writing about as a journalist were pushed to the limit. What if you could get inside and really see what was going on? In my new book, The Director, what if a new director came to the CIA in his first week, somebody walked into the American consulate in Hamburg and said, "You've been hacked, we're inside your systems." What would he do? Where would he turn? And so that, for me, through my whole career, it's been starting with things that are real and then thinking, well, what if? What would these people do if the next thing was pushed?
I think to some extent we all do that because we're all attuned, like everyone in the country, we're immersed, you know, with media constantly, and it's a flicker or a Twitter away, you know, a world story. I think what we as novelists, as fiction writers do is put a different spin. I'll see something and it can be the most bizarre, the craziest thing. You think, how in the world did someone get in that situation? And you start asking the what ifs and put just a little different spin on the factual story, and that's where I have come up with some ideas with which to work and expand on.
And years ago, readers would write in and say, oh, the government would never do that. And now, of course, they're saying, oh, maybe they would.
I found, too, that the journalism training I had as a matter of technique has been very helpful because we create fictional worlds, but they have to be recognizable to the readers. So being a journalist, I would go out, interview people, get the facts, try to create the scenario in a very realistic, concrete way, and I think that's helped my fiction quite a bit.
Karin, how did you get started?
Well, I just make stuff up, so, you know, and that's, my father teases me because I was such a daydreamer as a child, and he thinks it's wonderful I get paid for it now. Yeah. But, you know, like these guys that I'm here with today, we all just pay attention to things, and we have these wild imaginations where we take the kernel of a crime or something weird that happens and we turn it into an entire book. We all get asked, you know, hey, I've got this great idea for a book. You write it and we'll split the proceeds. And the idea really isn't the hard part. It's sitting down and figuring out, well, how are the characters going to tell this story? And for a lot of us, it's, well, how is the character going to change because of this? Because when people are affected by crime, it changes them, whether they're victims or investigators or people in the community. And so that's a real focus in a lot of our work is, you know, how is this going to change people? Lee is very fortunate because Jack Reacher never changes.
Yeah, I mean,
he just buys a new toothbrush.
Reacher never changes. But in general, Karin's right that the best book is not watching the detective work on a crime. It's watching the crime work on the detective. The moral implications, the psychological stress that the detective is under. Reacher is immune from that. He's the same at the end of the book than at the beginning. He doesn't learn much because he knew it all to start with. He's just this unstoppable force.
You know, Sandra and I were talking, and she made the remark that in television people tend to be quite jealous of other people's success. But she said when a writer writes a good book, all writers celebrate it. Why is that, Sandra?
Well, because I think we're all readers first, and we all love a good story. And I personally think that what is good for one author is good for everyone. I remember when the Harry Potter books were so popular and they were having midnight parties, you know, and the mothers were taking their children to get the hats and the, you know, everything and the magic wands, and they were having, you know, galas at bookstores. And someone asked me, said, aren't you a little jealous? Don't you wish they'd do that for you? I said, they are doing that for me. Because while the mothers are standing there in line, they might pass a Sandra Brown book and pick it up for the first time. So I think that I celebrate when there's a phenomenon in the publishing industry.
Anything that gets people to read is good.
Yeah.
Well, what are you guys reading now? Karin, what are you reading?
Well, I just finished Lee's. I really enjoyed it, personal. But right now I'm reading The Quick, which is a kind of gothic Victorian book. It's really fascinating. We don't always read thrillers. I think one of my favorite books ever was Sandra's that she wrote a few years ago, Sweetwater. It was
Rainwater.
Rainwater. I'm not very good with titles.
Yeah.
She just told me. I said, what is it? But it's a wonderful book because she's so great at writing characters. And I think that's something we all focus on is, you know, not just the broader story, but who is this character and what are they going to do that's really going to pull the reader in and make them interesting to the reader.
What do you think is the most significant book you ever read?
Oh,
what's the one
boy.
that had the biggest impact on you?
As a writer, I think the novels of Graham Greene are the ones I go back to again and again. Sometimes when I'm starting a book, I'll just see how he did it. You know, The Heart of the Matter, The Quiet American. These are just, they're very modern books. They're so elegant. I read a lot of history, so right now what's on my device is a book called Lawrence in Arabia, which is the story of T.E. Lawrence, and it's just scarily appropriate for the mess that we're all looking at in the Middle East now. It shows how these lines in the sand that are the countries of the Middle East got drawn in complete duplicity. You know, a series of lies by Britain and France, and it just makes your skin crawl.
He talks about reading it on his device. Would you rather read it in a book or?
I'm a paper guy, although that's not to say that I don't have the e-readers for convenience. And sometimes there's that instant gratification. I read a review of a book, I hit a button, and there it is.
Yeah, I'm pretty much back to paper. I've tried the electronic devices, and they're great for traveling. If you're on the road for 2-3 weeks, then they're really good. But without any agenda at all, I just have drifted back to paper books. Yeah.
What are you two reading?
Well, right now, being here in the nation's capital, a wonderful book, Magnificent Catastrophe, Larson's book about the election of 1800. And if we think politics is newly invented now, no, it's exactly the same as it was back then.
I'm reading a book, nonfiction, called Jet Set. It's about the introduction of the Boeing 707 in 1958 and the way that changed the world, that we could all get around so much faster and more easily and travel en masse, and it's pretty good, yeah, fascinating.
Sandra?
I just finished Greg Iles' Natchez Burning. It was about the sins of the fathers being revisited during the civil rights wars in Mississippi in 1964.
Let me ask you this question. What about, are there still places to go to promote books? I mean, Barnes & Noble is, we see it shrinking.
We go and face the nation.
Yeah. We're going to take over from those boring old senators.
Yeah.
You know,
what about the future of books? Are people still reading? I mean, I do, but
if you go to a bookstore to give a lecture, and that's, I'm sure all of us do that on our book tours, seeing a group of people in that setting who are, every one of them, you can see in their eyes how much they love reading, and you try to explain to them what you do and the sense that they're in it with you. So a way in which a book comes alive again. It's dead when you finish it, but it comes alive in the mind of the reader. And when you're in a group of those people, it's exciting.
People love story. Everything's a story. A television commercial is a 30-second story. People will always consume stories. The exact form in which they will consume them changes from time to time, but reading is like, it's a virus that sleeps in the ground. It will always be there, and it bursts out periodically and becomes huge and then dies away, comes back. Reading will always be there.
Despite what we've heard, the last year 300,000 books, titles, were published in the United States. And those are traditional books, not self-published books. That's e-books as well as print books. And the market expanded last year, 2013.
Karin, does it bother you that with the coming of Twitter and Facebook and all that in these really short messages, do you think people's attention spans are shortening? Is it harder for people to read a book now than it used to be?
I think that it's probably a relief because you get so much more when you read a book and you have the ability to sort of lose yourself. And the whole point of a book is to shut out the rest of the world. And people really need that now. The more connected we are, the more we need time to ourselves.
I agree. I have gotten to the point where at a certain hour of the evening, I shut down the phone, the iPad, the everything, and I don't look at it again. And I sit and read, and I have a conversation with my husband, and because we are now almost forced to do a lot of social media promotion and everything, and it just gets consuming, and at some point I feel like it's sensory overload. I can't handle anymore, and to me reading is that escape, it's that relaxation.
Very well said. Well, thanks. This is really fun. I knew it would be, and I'm really glad you all could come this morning. I'll be back in just a minute with a tribute to a real American hero and the author who told us about it.